2023. So a lot of what we're talking about today, and by the way, I'm assuming most of you have had at least an introduction to the concept of the transect. It's part of the smart code, and we'll be referencing a smart code module which my firm drafted later in the presentation. But the transect is essentially really just an organizing principle for urban environments, and it has a particular relevance in a retail application, which you'll see shortly. But the idea is to sort of begin to transform the suburban and urban landscapes from the more conventional suburban development model to the transect-based model, which is by definition more rational, more sustainable, more efficient, and has a whole range of benefits, not to mention the fact that it's just a lot more fun place to hang out. And it also has tangible market benefits because, as you can see on the images on the left, in conventional suburban development, you're really only as good as your last project. And the lifespan on a typical CSD retail project is, potentially 10 or 15 years until the next new bright, shiny object opens up down the street. So these projects that you're looking at here are projects that have multi-generational lifespans. The one in the upper right-hand corner is one of my favorite places, and I visit it every time I'm in the Chicago area. It's Market Square in Lake Forest, and that was built in about 1916, and is still one of the most popular retail destinations in the north, the Chicago suburbs, Lakeshore suburbs. So what we're really trying to do is build places of lasting value and lasting appeal that can benefit the communities that we are creating and be pleasant revenue-producing places in their own right. So retail involves two interrelated pieces: project design and market considerations. Of those two, the project design is actually by far the easiest part. And as I said, there's lots of resources and lots of examples of project design that you can look at. And even though the projects being built today with these characteristics and attributes do have things that differentiate themselves from pre-war models, really all you need to do is just go find a good streetcar suburb and look at the retail in those areas around those old streetcar stops, and you'll see pretty much 98% of what you need to know about the design side. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the market considerations, which is the focus of this particular presentation, which I've given previously at the CNU, but really I think it's important information for you to know at this point in your introduction to New Urbanism in general. So market positioning is essentially what do you build and where do you build it? And typically in most New Urbanist projects, the where is defined by other criteria than what's the best place to build retail. A lot of suburban greenfield New Urbanist projects, T&Ds, are built where there's enough land of sufficient size and at the right price to build a new community from scratch. That generally does not coincide with the most mature market for consumer demand. So sort of trying to understand how to slot in a New Urbanist project into that existing suburban context is critically important to the success of your retail and the success of the project as a whole. So the characteristics that distinguish retail center types are scale, the size of the retail offering overall, the tenant mix, which is usually determined by or is defined by the anchor tenant and the collective retail categories represented, and the size of the individual stores. And the tenant mix and the intended trade area, size and makeup. All of three of those things are related to the size of the consumer market that you're attempting to capture. And all of these are really shaped by basically the shopping trip. So retail centers and collective shopping districts basically are defined by the trade area they're intended to serve. So a grocery-anchored neighborhood shopping center, for instance, is defined by the weekly grocery shopping trip. And so the tenants that occupy that center along with the grocery store really work off of that trip as well. So you have these kinds of daily need type uses that are associated with that use. So, and then there's different center types based on different trips. So the basic retail categories, when you talk about it from a merchandising point of view, the things that are actually sold or the services offered are convenience goods, and this talks about this trip, which are the goods that are needed and purchased frequently. They're usually located close to where you live or work. And by the way, grocery falls in the convenience goods categories. Shoppers' goods, which are goods and services on which shoppers will expend the most effort. In other words, they'll do the comparison shopping. That's typically the kind of thing you would have found in a department store, for instance. Specialty goods are more kind of boutique items. They tend not to have a definitive trade area because they're sort of really identifying specific niches within the market that they're pursuing. And then impulse goods, which are things that are designed specifically to kind of attract your attention and something that you would purchase, not planning to purchase, and those are the kinds of things that really kind of leverage the customer being in a location for any particular purpose or reason, either to buy one of these other goods or perhaps visiting a place on holiday or just because it's a fun place to hang out. So the other thing that's relevant to urbanist retail and to retail in general is the idea, again, of the shopping center model, which is that shopping centers that distinguish themselves, by the way, from a sort of an organically grown kind of Main Street shopping district, is that they are planned, developed, owned, leased, and managed as a unit. So they're really sort of optimized around the consumer market that they're trying to capture. And they have a lot of advantages as shopping centers over a traditional organic Main Street community in the sense that they can sort of kind of internally subsidize rent structures so that they can bring in tenants that may not generate a lot of income, but generate a lot of foot traffic or patronage, and then they recapture the value of that subsidy on other tenants who are able to capitalize on it and capitalize on that and benefit from the foot traffic that those other tenants. A classic example again is a department store or grocery store, which typically pays sort of below market rents because they're the reason why everybody comes to that center. And then the inline tenants, the other tenants in the center, will pay more basically to subsidize the presence of the grocery store. So when you're doing an organic Main Street, it's much harder to manage and organize and build in the ability to do that kind of more comprehensive management and leasing. One of the reasons why I wasn't, as I said, able to prepare as much new material for this presentation is because I was working in one of those organic shopping districts out in Seattle, and it's very complicated but possible. Most of the successful Main Street shopping districts today will have some kind of a coordinated marketing and management, whether it's a merchants association or what have you. So when you're designing or developing a retail component in a new urbanist project, thinking about those management and operations, and in particular leasing kind of from a more comprehensive perspective, is going to be critical to the success of your project and designing for those uses as well. So factors that influence retail siting and programming: site constraints, size, access, and visibility, market characteristics, the household incomes, the number of households, and so forth within the trade area. The competitive framework is a really critical piece of the equation, and one that is often either overlooked or poorly understood within the new urbanist community. And it's something that we're going to focus on a lot when we get into the case study section of the presentation. And then the regional context, which will often determine where and how much retail and how you can position your project relative to the other competitive offerings in the area. So when we start to take all of these ideas and translate them into a new urban form, a walkable, compact, walkable, mixed-use town center, The reason why I'm giving you this, sort of the ULI shopping center definitions is because those are really predicated, again, on market demand and these shopping center characteristics. But they existed before the shopping centers were invented, which they came into being about the 1920s. So these are the equivalents, if you will, in sort of translating how you think about these things in a new urbanist context. So a convenience store, for instance, in a suburban context would be the neighborhood or corner store in a new urbanist community. A convenience center would be sort of the equivalent of Main Street shops. Neighborhood center would be town center shops, and a regional center would be a downtown shopping district. These are the numbers which, by the way, if you go to, if you Google the smart code and go to the smart code website, there's a module in there on sustainable commerce which has all of these numbers. So if you don't feel like taking these notes, you can get that information there. But the convenience store, again, is for these items that are purchased on a more or less daily basis or weekly basis. They can be as small as 1,000 square feet. They have a very localized trade area, and they serve a fairly small consumer market. You know what those look like. A convenience center may be anchored by a convenience store, or nowadays that would probably be something like a CVS drugstore, which in some respects has kind of become the general store in a lot of neighborhoods. It has general merchandise, a limited selection of food and beverage, and in addition to obviously the pharmacy and seasonal goods and so forth. But this has become in a lot of neighborhoods the equivalent of basically the general store. And so it serves it has a larger trade area, serves a larger population, and in a lot of places takes the place of a grocery store. It's the kind of center that for a lot of new urbanist projects, that would be kind of not a bad mix to aspire to. And that's what, different couple versions of what that might look like. Neighborhood center, the DOI definition is a grocery-anchored shopping center, so it would have a lot of the things of the convenience center plus the grocery, and then that would typically would support other things like a dry cleaners, a branch bank, that kind of thing. So you're starting to see this pattern where there's incremental increases both in the size of the center but also in the range of goods and services offered. And with each increment up, there's usually a new anchor tenant that comes in and serves that need or fills that role. And the neighborhood center is probably the shopping center type or the mix of uses that most define neighborhood. So if you're doing a T&D, bringing in a grocery store is the kind of thing that would be the ideal tenant to anchor your town center mix. And if any of you are familiar with Kentlands, the DPZ project that was built in Montgomery County in Maryland, suburban DC, that basically had sort of a neighborhood center slash the next step up, which would be the community shopping center mix. And so this is sort of some examples of what that might look like. These are the graphics, by the way, that need to be updated, so I apologize for that, but I'll tell you where to find more relevant and current versions of all of these. And so I think there's one in here that didn't make. The next step up, by the way, from this one, the neighborhood center, is what's referred to as the community shopping center, and that's the criteria for that meeting that definition is the addition of a junior department store. So Kentlands would basically have that because it's got a discount department store. So these increments of scale moving up, and then the regional center is more or less the analogous to the regional mall. You have a greater diversity of goods and services, typically multiple department stores, and so forth. However, in a mall, you would not usually have the grocery uses that you would have because there's no neighborhood there. So in a shopping district, you would have both those more regional goods and services, but also the kinds of daily needs that you would find within the neighborhood. And so understanding where you fit into that spectrum of uses is really critically important in designing your center. So we just touched on all of those. Moving on and to the next subject, which is going to be really, probably this is where the real takeaway message is for today's presentation. But before we do that, are there any questions, immediate questions on any of the things we just covered? Okay, good. So that was pretty straightforward and self-explanatory. A couple of years ago, we did an 11 neighborhood community sort of master plan redevelopment strategy for Omaha, Nebraska. And it was sort of the pre-war neighborhoods between the historic downtown of Omaha and the outer, post-war suburbs. And in looking at the retail patterns within that context, this sort of interesting diagram emerged, which I found very useful to kind of speak to. And it's what I call the transportation land use connection. Because in a traditional downtown, which is what you're looking at here on the left, let's see if I can get the right button here. So this was meant to just basically diagrammatically represent downtown historic Omaha, their urban core. And what you saw were these little neighborhood centers embedded within the larger urban core. And then you had typically a dense regional mix of retail offerings at the core, and the trade area for that was really the entire city. And this was that was all of Omaha, probably, up into about the turn of the last century. And so that could have been, this diagram would work for almost any city at that time, Chicago, Baltimore, Washington, what have you. But then in the 1920s, with the advent of streetcars, what happened is the market started to expand outside of that historical core. The street and block network was still fairly relevant, but you were now beginning, the transportation component was beginning to sort of kind of concentrate and focus your access to that consumer market. And so what you started to get was these interesting little, jumped ahead, right? These interesting little streetcar or commuter rail based walkable mixed-use town centers. And if you go up again the North Shore of Chicago, you'll see these all over the place. I'm sure they're here in Dallas, probably Highland Park, and any major city that had a streetcar network in the 1920s. This is about where, and one of the reasons why I like this diagram is this is about where a lot of the new urbanist suburban infill projects are happening at about that scale. And in many respects, it sort of kind of highlights the balance in the transition from a more purely walkable, transit-based model of urban form to this kind of hybrid, sorry, I'm still getting the wrong one here, hybrid version where you have both the automobile and transit. And so you're still getting a lot of the benefits of urban form from walkability and mixed use in these little centers, but out here on the fringe, you're starting to get something that more resembles the coming post-war pattern of development. So this is now the outer suburbs, the post-war suburbs. So this was sort of, pre-1920s vintage Omaha. This was sort of the golden age of, if you will, garden suburbs. And this is when it all started to go terribly wrong. So there are some interesting things, though, when you start to look at this, because in some respects, this is kind of the history of the evolution of urban form in the United States and its relevance to retail, in that what's happening now is that you had pretty much the same number of households as you had here, here, and here, but now they're all spread out. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is they're spread out in these, what we refer to as these dendritic street networks. You can't simply, go, you don't have a multitude of options for getting from point A to point B like you do in the stored fabric. You're more or less obligated to come out here to the major arterials and then come to the major arterial intersection on your way to or from work. And what the retailers quickly figured out was that you no longer have to go into the neighborhood to serve that consumer market. All you have to do is park yourself right there, and you'll drive right by their front door twice a day, guaranteed. And there's a couple of reasons why this is important. One is because there's in retail, size matters, basically. And the nature of the way the consumer, the trade areas break down is that people will tend to shop at the place that offers the greatest diversity of choice within all other things being equal, closest to them. So the retailers quickly figured out that they could take all of the things that used to be, segregated by spatial relationships and proximity, and put them all in one spot, and then you were obligated to drive by that, come to them versus the other way around. And it really sort of changed retailing in this country and globally from that point forward. But understanding the how and the why is really important, because what's happening is we're actually building new urbanism, and this is the other key point here, is that every time they went up a notch in scale, they not only served this larger market, but they also stole a portion of the consumer market from the previous iteration. And of course, most of you have seen examples of this in your own communities. And it's one of the things that's been the biggest challenge in terms of doing infill, even urban infill development, because of encroachment in these suburban formats coming into our urban centers. So figuring out how to, that's the rule that I was referring to a second ago. That's the reason why this has become so complicated, and why the design is the easy part, and figuring out the what, where is really the much more difficult and complicated piece. Let me just check where we are here on time. I think we're doing well. So this is, so that was sort of the schematic version of it, and this is really more of what it looks like on the ground. So this is, most urban regions actually develop more like this. Sorry, I keep pushing the wrong button here. As a sort of a more or less dense core, some pre-war development around that dense core in a relatively tight, small-scale street networks, hierarchical street networks, and so forth. And then the odd outlying community, and this is usually shaped by topography, a whole range of things, but also by these larger-scale regional road networks which come out here. So in the post-war era, when all of that filled in with sprawl, which should be represented there in yellow, we had the same kind of dynamic that happened in that Omaha diagram, but in a much more organic form. And the suburban retailers came in and they figured out, hey, we can park ourselves right here between all these suburban households and basically capture all of this market and most of this market along this periphery here in these sort of pre-war neighborhoods. So if you look at this as kind of the competitive context that you will be building in or designing for, it's really important to understand where your project sits and resides within this context, because that's going to have a lot to do with determining what you can build and how you can build it. So without going into a lot more detail, it should be relatively clear. There's ways to determine where those things are. So the difference between urban markets typically is density. They control their consumer market by density and proximity, and suburban consumer markets are dictated largely by the size of the road in front of the box, because that represents the market that you have access to. It's basically an aggregated market that road is providing for you that you would not otherwise be able to capture and control if you were relying on the more typical density and proximity model. So when we start to look at that in the context of the transect, what we're trying to do is think about how to use the transect as a tool, not only to determine what's appropriate for your particular project, but also how to begin the long process of sort of kind of rebuilding our regional fabric in an urban form. And so I know that this, regional planning is not a huge focus on for new urbanists, but the reality is that larger urban context really defines the market context in which your project needs to operate. So this is how this would classically have laid out in an urban, in a large regional context, with the primary shopping districts in the urban core. Of course, that's no longer true. They're now typically out here on the fringe. And so the first step in trying to figure out how to begin to repair that model, that traditional urban regional model, is to actually know what it looks like and understand how it evolved and how it functions and then where we can begin to remedy that. And I know suburban retrofit is a very big part of this discussion at this conference. But this is a diagram that's in the Sustainable Commerce module for the Smart Code that begins to talk to this idea. And what it does is it shows what it's intended to represent is the incremental growth of urban places. So a small rural crossroads might be at this stage in terms of its life cycle and successional growth model. And then with each succeeding successional model, it becomes denser, bigger, larger. And so when you track the retail across this full spectrum, it's an interesting exercise in sort of understanding how retail functions in this larger context. So assuming for a moment that we're not looking at the overall triangle diagram, but just what it's representing as a retail market potential, this would be like a small rural hamlet or village or something like that. And the amount of retail that it could support, both in terms of consumer demand, but also just in terms of the kinds of merchandise categories that it can support, would be about the equivalent of a neighborhood store, or in this case, would be the country store, proverbial country store. But as you sort of kind of go up through subsequent levels of urbanism, what happens is that not only do you get more retail, but the nature of that retail begins to change. It gets more sophisticated, more diverse, and so forth. And then the other thing is, but the other important point to recognize here is that a lot of these earlier sort of lower order retail types are still present. They're actually just there in levels of greater frequency. So what would have been the country store out here in the hamlet basically becomes the corner store in a downtown, in a walkable downtown. So this is really kind of the larger market context and competitive context that you will be operating in. So one of the challenges that we're having right now as a professional group, as a discipline, is trying to figure out where do we plug in our projects into this context, and how does that influence and affect the kind of retail that we can do. And so a lot of new urbanist projects right now are really sort of occupying this area of the diagram. This is sort of the T3, T4 area, which would be kind of the close-in suburban neighborhoods. But they're trying to do this kind of a town center. And so that's a real challenge. So one of the things we need to understand is, again, is figuring out where you fit into this larger context and what you're willing to take on. Because when you come into that existing market context, it's a little bit like, being the new kid on the block. You've got an immediate decision to make, which is to find, the biggest other kid you can that you think you can take, and try to establish your, place in the pecking order. The other thing you can do is, if you're not feeling confident, you can take on the dominant players in the market that you're entering into, is to try to find a niche, find a place, an underserved market, and fill that. And so when you start talking about the kinds of uses that you think are realistically supportable, then you can begin to design your town center around that, who your anchor tenants are going to be, and so forth. The other big advantage that you have that the conventional suburban shopping centers don't have is you've got an additional amenity that they don't have, and that is the quality of the place. And so that's where the physical design becomes important again, because it's one of the things that you're selling. It's part of the amenity value that you're offering. The other key thing, obviously, is convenience, because what you're saying is, look, you don't have to go to 3 or 4 different shopping centers. You don't have to park on a parking lot that's so far across you literally get back in your car and drive to the other store at the other end that you need to shop at. But you can literally park once, get out of your car, take care of all your daily needs, fill all of your shopping needs without having to move that car again, and then also have, in the process, a very pleasant experience. So that's the thing that's changed dramatically since the last time I probably did this presentation, is the fact that there's a lot more examples now to point to of how to manage these things well. And I'm going to talk about a couple of those here in the case studies. But this is really important because it's amazing how many people go out there and try to design these town centers without really understanding these fundamental ideas. And when they don't work or they don't perform as hoped, what often gets blamed isn't, oh, well, we didn't do our market study or we didn't really understand how to position our project. It's, oh, you can't do mixed use, you can't do walkable mixed use, et cetera. And then the other thing that you have to understand is that in the near term, when you go in, you're still competing oftentimes in a suburban context, which means that people will view or may view some of the things that you have to offer in a different light than you had expected or intended them to understand it. So you need to sort of kind of bridge the gap between the suburban market context that your competitors are working into while still offering a lot of the benefits of compact walkable mixed use. So this is just another graphic version of the transect. And so understanding where you are in that larger context is critically important. Okay, so before we get into case studies, any immediate questions, thoughts, ideas, anything that you want to raise on any of that? Billy just asked about the online market, basically online retail. That question, I get asked that question about once every, well, actually pretty much every time I do this. Online retailing is still a relatively small percentage of the overall retail industry. And what's happening is two things. One is that there's much more of a convergence right now between online retailing and bricks and mortar retailing. Most of the purely online retailers are now opening bricks and mortar outlets, but more importantly, most of the bricks and mortar retailers are getting much more sophisticated about their online presence. And actually, that's a great question for another reason. When I was first asked that question, I said, well, I don't know yet, what the long-term implications are going to be, but here's my best guess. And this has been pretty much playing out. True to form, the commodity type retail, i.e. power centers, I don't know if any of you know what a power center is, but it's a shopping center comprised exclusively of category killer retailers, and category killer is defined just as you would expect. It's for that category of retail, it offers such a broad range of product that it effectively kills that category. So Best Buy, Home Depot, Barnes & Nobles, those were all category killers when they first came in. They knocked the small scale independent retailers out of the market initially. But the thing is that the retail online shopping has really put those types of retail purveyors in a very difficult position because the kinds of merchandise that they typically sold is merchandise you didn't have to see, you didn't have to touch, you didn't have to feel. And so it was the perfect candidate for online shopping. And the other types of retail that typically occupy both small scale Main Street type retail shopping districts and often many new urbanist shopping areas are those kinds of unique boutique specialty retailers, independents, and so forth. And what it's allowed them to do is actually to reach out beyond their immediate consumer market and compete essentially either in a regional or national context. And there's lots of interesting little bookstores and stuff on great little main streets in a wonderful neighborhood that we just love to put in your new urbanist shopping area. And you could have never justified bringing them in previously, but now you can because 90% of their sales are not actually to people who walk in the front door. So there's good sides and bad sides to everything, and the thing about retail is it is a very dynamic, competitive environment. So with the types of places we're building and designing, we need to understand what our competitive advantages are and leverage those to the full extent. Okay, so here's some of the case studies that I'd like to discuss in terms of how you relate your retail component of your project to both the physical and the market context that it would be competing in. So in the ideal world, your project would occupy four corners. I never know how these are going to show up on any particular projector. So can everybody see that? That was intended to be four neighborhoods on 4 quadrants of the intersection of 2 arterials. Now, if you're fortunate enough to be developing a project that's big enough, or have a client who's developing a project big enough that it actually can encompass and capture 4 arterials, then your work is basically done. Because all you're really going to do is come in here and build your shopping district right there at the intersection of those. This would be the equivalent of our main intersection. And there's lots of times when we've been able to kind of affect that, even when we didn't have that specific location. But once you have that kind of a configuration, which is ideal, obviously that's your main intersection. This would be a network of smaller scale streets. You would be merchandising primarily to that intersection. You might be putting, some of your anchor tenants out here in the end. Or the other thing that we use a lot, by the way, as an anchor is parking, because most urbanist projects are still competing in a suburban context, and most of your customers will arrive by car. So you have to have both the parking of a suburban shopping center as well as the walkable environment of a real, urban place. But one of the things you can do, knowing that many of your customers are going to arrive by car, is locate the parking in an area that will help to generate the kind of cross-shopping that a shopping center would use an anchor tenant for. So basically, parking becomes another anchor that you can use to help encourage the kinds of cross-shopping and foot traffic that you would like to maximize the sales performance of all your tenants. So this is the ideal scenario. Very few new urbanist projects have these kinds of characteristics. And by the way, there's our, this is a little bit bigger than a quarter mile, because that would be a quarter mile walking radius right there. But again, the other thing that's really important to note about this is that even though this is not just retail, this is mixed use, which means people are going to be living here, they're going to be ideally working here and so forth. So you're going to have a very high capture rate within this, and a significant portion of your consumer market is going to be pedestrian based. But out here on the outer fringes, in all likelihood, these people could just as easily be driving to their town center or riding their bicycle or what have you, but the idea is that you can still get to your daily needs within the local street network of your respective neighborhood. So this is kind of a change from where the new urbanists were at 20 years ago. They were thinking that, you had to put it in the middle of the neighborhood, and of course, the projects that did that typically had unsuccessful retail projects. So this is one of probably the key evolutions within the new urbanist community about where to put the retail. Everybody now acknowledges it needs to have access to the greatest consumer potential that you can offer it. You just don't want to do it at the expense of the building a quality urban environment, walkable mixed-use environment. This is sort of more typical. In this case, you have your arterial out here, and you only have one side of that arterial, or a primary arterial and a secondary or minor arterial. So in that case, what you do is similar. You basically locate your retail at that intersection. And there's a lot of reasons for that, besides that's where most of the traffic is, but also that's typically would be a signalized intersection, which facilitates access into and out of the shops and so forth and so on. But again, even in this model, probably 60 or 70% of your consumer market is going to be coming from here, not from here. So that's why it's out here and not in here. And there's, again, ways that you can design these centers to help kind of bridge the gap between those two realities, but being aware of them is critically important. And if you have, I'm not sure where this one's going, I think this was a minor, if you don't have a second arterial, you just basically find the biggest road you can find, or you create it, and that becomes the road into your project. And then again, you try to make sure that your internal street network allows you to, all of the residents within your neighborhood or your project or your development to access the goods and services. So they're getting 90% of the benefit of the value of that proximity to those daily goods and services, and the retailers themselves, the merchants, are getting 90% of the benefit of this larger outside market here. So these are some examples. These are fairly older projects. We've got a lot of new ones that you can find on my website, or if anybody wants to send me an email, I'll be happy to show you some of the things that haven't even made it on the website yet. But again, the idea here is that this would be the arterial, this would be the commercial center, and the idea that you would facilitate access, visibility, and so forth. All the things you would do in a conventional suburban shopping center, except here it connects to a real neighborhood. And so what you really want to do is, and the other challenge with the arterial frontages is you don't often control them. Those are often state highways, or for whatever reason, you don't get to dictate the shape and the form of that arterial. And so even though this is a potential access to a much larger consumer market, it's not really conducive to the kind of walkable environment that you would like to be creating. So coming in tangentially to that is one way to address that issue. So again, you get a lot of the benefit of access to that larger regional market without any of the negative impacts. And by the way, this is pretty much diagrammatically exactly the same as Market Square in Chicago, which has again been a very successful and continues to be a very successful neighborhood and regional destination for the last 100 years. The other thing that's really important is to be realistic in terms of your expectations with regard to the scale of the project you're going to build. Even today, going back to the Chicago model, and I'm sure this is probably true here in Dallas as well too, a lot of those old 1920s vintage streetcar suburbs still have fantastic neighborhood shopping districts, and most of those are 1 or 2 stories. And even where the land values would today dictate a much higher density development, those same old neighborhood retail buildings are still there, and they're still at that 1 and 2 stories height. So it's possible to do a really nice, walkable, neighborhood scale commercial district at 1 or 2 stories. Why this is important, I'll talk about in a little bit, but it's density is expensive, and mixed use is expensive. So you want to make sure that when you make the decision to go to mixed use and higher density, that it's justified by the market's ability to support that. And even though you're going to have a much higher level of local capture, and in most new urbanist projects, you can use the retail as an amenity to help drive value to your other component pieces, typically residential, it sometimes a little bit goes a lot further than you think, and it doesn't put you as a developer in as difficult a position, sort of right out of the gate by overbuilding for what the market can actually support. So this is, by the way, that was a sketch, and this is actually one of our village centers for a small infill T&D project we did with DPZ, and this is just outside of Asheville, North Carolina, in a small town called Black Mountain. Asheville's got, by the way, a great walkable downtown. The other thing that was interesting about this was basically financed out of cash flow, much the way Seaside's commercial area was financed. So that's one of the other advantages of sort of building in a form that both fits the context, the market context, but also the traditional historic context of the area, is it allows you to sort of build out incrementally and at a scale that gives you most of the value you need in terms of the project overall, while still managing risk, which is, of course, what the whole point of development is. Yes? Sorry, what did you say the name of that town was? Black Mountain. The name of the project is Cheshire. It was a DPZ designed, Dwayne Plater Zyberg designed, basically what we would probably characterize as suburban infill, but it was very close to a historic walkable town center, downtown, discrete from Asheville. And it's kind of a seasonal tourist market, but it was also a huge amenity for the neighborhood itself that we designed and built. And it's now a very successful neighborhood commercial area. They've got some really great, unique tenants in there that really make it a nice adjunct both to downtown Black Mountain and Asheville. And this is what I like to call or I have been calling, the cake and eat it too model, which is a pretty classic scenario where this was in Nashville, outside of Nashville, large suburban arterial. This was really still, the market was still kind of maturing at this point. Developer wanted to build a T&D back here. Oops, put it again here, back here, and wanted to build it and take advantage of his frontage for a commercial project. And what we did was 2 things. One is there was a primary entrance into the community. So we did a plan. This is the entrance going back into the residential community. This is sort of our more traditional Main Street component of the project. think actually this shows it here. Kind of jump ahead here. Oh, anyway, this is sort of more the small scale, neighborhood-oriented component of the project, and this is more, relates more directly to the suburban arterial. Because this is a suburban arterial, and this is still very much a suburban market context, we just didn't feel that this would have been viable without that, first of all, and second of all, this wouldn't have been viable up here in that form. So this is, again, very similar to Kentlands, which was built in 1992, one of the first large greenfield suburban T&Ds to be built, another project designed by DPZ, and they did exactly that. They built a fairly conventional suburban shopping center appended onto a walkable, mixed-use, neighborhood-serving retail district, which is doing very, very well now. And then back here was the residential neighborhoods. So this was a huge amenity that was sort of unique and special to Kentlands, and then this was something that served not only the Kentlands residents, but also the larger surrounding market. And this is actually starting to urbanize now, which was the thing that we're trying to do, and DPZ did this originally as well, is if and when this urbanizes and the context around it urbanizes, then you're able to come back in, because this was designed in the form of streets and blocks. You can come back in and urbanize that shopping center as the market context around it changes. And I'm sorry, the register on those images was not very good, but hopefully you get the idea. So the point is that sometimes it's better to sort of tailor your project in the near term to where the market is now, knowing that that in the long term that market may change, but don't design it in a way that precludes you from modifying that retail component down the road. And the other thing that's important to the other takeaway here, there's more value there. So if you design your project correctly, you can continue to harvest value from that location as that market continues to evolve. And so that kind of building in that successional redevelopment potential into your project, even if you're in a very suburban context, is a great way to retain that potential. Yes?
Before you get to this state, the previous state,
yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the tenant mix that you had?
Oh, yeah, sure. This is just, oh, I'm sorry, this is just intended to be a conventional grocery-anchored neighborhood shopping center, because that's what the market was. So it was a grocery store and a junior department store, or vice versa.
And what did you have in the back?
This would have been more the small-scale, independent retailers, boutiques, those kinds of things. They're, in some respects, they're not quite in the category of hobbyist, retailers, but there are people who, for whatever reason, feel, you might do live works back there or something like that. So trying to sort of split the difference is the key takeaway here, and a successful example of this right now that you can see 20 years in is Kentlands, where you're actually starting to see this evolutionary or successional model take place. We've got about 10 more minutes, so I'm going to try to zip ahead here real quick. And then you've got the street network in an urban location as in an idealized environment. Another thing, this is a project we did in El Salvador a while back, but it was this was a regional scale highway. This is a regional scale highway. This is a traditional urban center, and so there was a connection here that kind of came through the site, and this had already started to build out in a fairly suburban form. What we did here was basically reroute this route, this existing road through here, so that we could recapture that both sides of the street and add a secondary connection there and another connection here to a higher part of this project up above, another neighborhood center up ahead. And what that allowed us to do, this is our tenant mix, which I'll talk about in a second here, is sort of stretch that. This is what we would call the main intersection right here normally, but by offsetting this other leg, we're able to kind of stretch that 100% intersection, the value of that 100% intersection over a larger length. So these kinds of strategies here are critically important in the design and planning stage. All of the things that we're talking about in terms of the characteristics of walkable mixed use are still relevant right here in the urban form and the architecture and so forth. But this is something that's a strategic move that is done specifically to try to maximize the value of that connection over a longer area. And we applied this, I don't know if any of you know John Anderson, I think he's speaking here today. This is a project we did with him in Chico in the Central Valley of California plan we did with Leon Creer quite a few years ago. There's a regional mall located down here. The bulk of the consumer market is up here. They were currently coming down to this intersection and going around the project. So all we did was we provided them with a shortcut. And so we gave them a path of less resistance and then used that to drive energy and traffic into our town center. So this is a way, instead of coming out here and doing the retail in the corner, we basically just captured the market by putting it between where they were heading. So we were leveraging all of that regional retail down here as a destination to encourage the consumer market to come through and visit our town center. And it's a nice project from an urbanistic point of view and from an architecture point of view, but more importantly, it's a project that could have a successful town center that's within the neighborhood by using some of these other strategic options. Sorry, got all these other things. And that was the sketch that was intended to show what that could look like. And of course, we did a detailed merchandising plan for the entire town center. This was going to be our grocery store here on the right-hand side, and so forth and so on. And then a little thing like a economic crisis came along and kind of put the boots on that. But anyway, the other thing is this notion of thinking about why I started with this idea of the shopping centers, conventional shopping centers. It's how you merchandise your town center. You need to approach it just like a leasing agent would merchandise a shopping center, because that's really who your competition is. And so this idea of actually now beginning to take what looks like a very traditional, literally, a traditional street block network, even a very organically shaped one like this, and really sort of thinking about it more in terms of anchor tenants, sub-districts, and those kinds of things are critically important to having a successful project and to leasing it. This is another example. This is a interstate highway here, interchange. This is where you normally have that frontage road, that ubiquitous frontage road running along all the limited access highway arterials. And so what we did, instead of having that frontage road out there, we just brought it into the project and put our large big box retailers out here to take advantage of that, but then create a walkable town center environment that takes advantage of the attractive potential of these boxes. So thinking about in those kinds of terms is critically important. You have to be creative, because right now we're in this transition period, sort of half suburban, half urban, and most urbanist projects are not happening in the urban centers, although there are urban infill and urban center projects, but most are not. So this is more typical of the environment that a lot of them are happening in. This was a project where a developer was going to build a regional mall. This was a power center. There was an existing lake there, and they were going to append a lifestyle center onto this regional mall, which is very typical as a defensive move, actually, by a lot of regional mall owners. They were getting out in front of that, and we were just showing how you could take, the typical kinds of restaurants and so forth that would normally be in pad sites out here, and actually take all of those component pieces and begin to restructure them into the form of a compact, walkable, mixed-use shopping district that could now support residential, could support transit, and a whole variety of other uses that nobody would have ever thought of or considered in this location. And this is a project we did for the Princess Foundation, just again talking about the idea that even in very historic, very urban environments, this kind of thinking is critically important. This was an infill project in Lincolnshire, and just talking about merchandising and urban form and so forth. Because it has to work in a walkable environment at that pedestrian level and pedestrian scale. So how you do design your storefronts, how you merchandise your windows and so forth, all are important. This was actually an urban mall in Walthamstow in Greater London, another project we did for the Princess Foundation. I was given the developer's table to sit at, and this was literally about 15 minutes in the process. We showed them how they could compete with the suburban encroachment on their trade area while still enhancing and adding value to the urban neighborhood that they abut. And by the way, this is the longest market street in Europe, we were told, and sort of having these two things kind of operate in completely different physical environments didn't make any sense. So what we did was did a quick sketch plan to show how those two could be better integrated. This is the merchandising plan for that, which looks like it could be a medieval urban center instead of the regional mall plopped down in the middle of a medieval urban center that it is currently, and how you could even leave the mall in place. This was the expansion that we proposed as a massing diagram, but you saw the merchandising thinking behind it. There's the regional mall. We just treated the interior mall as an extension of the pedestrian network, and then if at some point in time, if they wanted to go forward and redevelop the mall itself, they could certainly do that. So the idea is always to sort of think outside the box. Mixed use is a big, everybody talks about mixed use. This is, by the way, this is how much to do a grocery store, just the amount of the portion, the segment of the total amount of retail expenditures an average person spends on an annual basis. You would need 77 levels of vertical mixed use to support the equivalent of ground floor retail for that. So thinking in these terms, horizontal mixed use, spend your money wisely, build the vertical mixed use where you're going to get the most value from it, both environmentally and in terms of market, to your highest density development around that. But this is where the real value comes from, is in those connections to the surrounding neighborhoods. And so a lot of what we've been talking about really relate to that. And so when we talk about mixed use, we're really talking about this, not this. And this is my sort of little graphic for that. That's the first model. That's the second model. So it has real implications, obviously, from an urban forum point of view. So these are kind of the market contexts that we were just talking about, and understanding where and how to apply these principles on a regional scale is critically important. It's going to have a huge impact on the success of your projects. And blah, blah, blah. Yes, you sort of already got that. The Transect is a great tool not only for infill, but also for sort of healing our regional centers. I predicted this about 10 years ago. It's now happening all over the place, or 15 years ago in a meeting very much like this. Everybody said, well, I said, watch what happens is the urbanism dictates the retail form, not the other way around. So as soon as we start building more real urban places, the retail will follow suit. I think you guys got this as a handout. Did you? I asked for that. If not, let me know. We'll try to get this to you. But this is just basically kind of a checklist of how to do contemporary, or how to do traditional, how to do contemporary retail in a traditional walkable mixed-use urban environment. And that's Palmer Square, if any of you aren't familiar with it, in downtown Princeton, New Jersey, built as a comprehensively planned, designed, merchandised, marketed shopping center in the 1920s. It's still probably the most valuable real estate in Princeton, and still doing very well. So we can do this. I think that's it.